All right, you're here with Eugene Collins, and this is a special segment here that we're doing with the ACLU. And you're here today to give us an update on the kids that were transferred to Angola. And this might have escaped a lot of our memories because a few organizations, as well as I forget the name of the project, from out of state, they came here along with the ACLU and actually sued the state to try to prevent these kids from winding up in Angola. The judge at the time actually said that kids probably shouldn't be in Angola, but they didn't know where else to send them, right? Mm-hmm. Today, we're hearing that some of those promises just weren't upheld. When we talk about what they promised would happen with these kids, those things haven't been met by the state of Louisiana. And I don't want to blame the department on this, right? Because the departments, with the department heads, the secretaries, they come and go, but the administration, the government stays the same, and this was definitely a plan to get these kids moved all the way from the top. Just like the plan that, they were in what some would call essentially these rehabilitation facilities at the planning of the tutelage of Governor Kathleen Babineau Blanco, who thought kids shouldn't be in jail. Mm-hmm. Now we kind of see, socially that thought kind of changing, especially with increased crime and all of that stuff, right? But these kids are in Angola, and some of the stuff that y'all were telling me is just atrocious to think that we have children average age 14 to 17 living in some of these conditions today in Angola. Megan, I want to give you the floor here to talk about that.
So thanks for having us. So it's been a year and a day since Governor Edwards announced that he would be sending children to the death row unit at Angola State Penitentiary. And at the time, many organizations came together, advocacy organizations, and urged the governor to change his mind, not to do that. And then we ended up suing. At the time, as you said, the judge made a determination that while this, in her opinion, didn't seem to be the best plan, she didn't know what else plan there was. So the secretary of OJJ made a lot of promises on the stand that day, and they have not been kept. And so we have spoken with many of the kids there, and we have gotten firsthand accounts of what is really happening there. And so one point I want to make is that these kids are adjudicated delinquent in civil proceedings. These are not criminal proceedings, these are children. And so it's very important when we're talking about the media hysterics around crime, we, reflect back on the era of the, super predator language. And now we're reliving that same language in different words and creating a narrative around kids, especially black kids, especially in urban areas, that is just untrue. And it's really important to look at the data because violent crime is going down, even in places like New Orleans, where there's a lot of media hysterics around crime there. Violent crime has gone down even since last year, and kids are being arrested at lesser rates, and so the narrative is just false, first of all. As to the conditions, it's also important to remember, as I said, that these are children. These are literally 14, 15, 16-year-old children. They are being housed in what has been historically a very litigated area of Angola because of the poor conditions. And on a death row unit, in teeny tiny cells, one of our children said he could stretch out his arms and touch both ends of his cell with his arms stretched out. So these are very, very, very small cells, and they are in their cells from at least 5 p.m. in the evening until 8 a.m. in the morning. They have no access to clean water in their cells. They have to request it if they need it, which is not always available. At one point in the litigation, there was mold growing on the sinks. It is just deplorable conditions for any human being, but especially a child. And so now what we're finding out is that just as there wasn't whenever adults were there, there was no air conditioning. And now as our temperatures climb in Louisiana, and we're all very uncomfortable in these temperatures, they are sitting in these essentially heat boxes where the walls and the floors are sweating because it's so hot. There's no air conditioner. There's occasionally fans, but they're not guaranteed. And then also they're using these very same cells for discipline. So kids are staying in there for days at a time, being let out only to shower, and shackled while showering. And so, like, we don't even, when you think about the way that we treat human beings, is this the way we want to treat human beings, and is this the way we want to treat our children?
Yeah, and when you told me that, right, that part of it, I just found sickening. And there's been experts that y'all consulted with that say that these temperatures are probably somewhere around 130 degrees, 139 degrees in the cells. So these kids are forced to have 15-hour days in these cells in temperatures that can get over 130 degrees, right? And this is exactly what we told folks. This is exactly what we said would happen. We said that they would be in subhuman conditions over time. Mm-hmm. We said, hey, they may not require them to go work the fields, but it's going to be like working the fields at some point. We told people that this would eventually happen if you sent children to a facility like this.
Yeah.
Because that's what this state has shown, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't care how clean the facility is or how much paint you put on the walls or how many ice cups you bring. None of that matters if the temps are getting over 130 degrees. And a 14-year-old kid, that can't be good for rehabilitating anybody, especially not a 14-year-old child.
No.
That's not a system that will rehabilitate that person. All you're creating is a much angrier person with more severe mental health issues.
And trauma.
And trauma. And trauma, because that's what you're doing. You're adding trauma on top of trauma in a person that already had trauma. You're basically building a more advanced criminal in these kind of situations.
Well, you'd have to think about historically, all the systems that have failed these kids that put them here in the first place. And so, just full stop, kids should never be at Angola. There are many failures within OJJ as far as facilities, as far as lack of resources and accommodations and education. And there's a lot of things happening in OJG just centrally. They got up at a court hearing and testified that they would ensure X, Y, and Z things have happened. And none of those things have happened. These kids are not getting educated. They don't have any teachers. They don't have access to books. They don't have access to their IEP accommodations. The food isn't edible. Many of them have told us that they have to eat chips out of the commissary just to sustain themselves because they can't physically eat the food because it's so disgusting. There's not access to clean water. There's not recreation. So their only recreation activity is to play basketball in 12 o'clock heat without any shade. And when they're under punishment, that's not even given. There's no access to family other than 2 phone calls a week, which even at the other OJJ facilities that are less than perfect, they have access. They can pick up the phone and call their family almost anytime they want. They were guaranteed access to their families, which they haven't been given. They were told that their families might even be brought by OJJ to the facility to visit them so they could have, because everyone recognizes that kids need their parents. Kids need their guardians and their moms and their dads. They need physical touch and they need that, and they have been deprived of that. And one thing that's really important to talk about when you talk about rehabilitation is that, in theory, Angola was supposed to be a rehabilitative program that you complete the program and you get out. XYZ steps, you can prove that you can behave, for lack of a better word, and you can get out. The issue is that that does not happen. It is clearly a punitive environment. So these kids are not meeting with counselors to work towards goals, to set out programming and all that stuff. None of that is happening. So these kids know that they are being dumped like trash because society feels like they're bad kids or not good enough. And so they feel that. And so the mental health aspect of that as well, the trauma of the fact that when they look out the windows, all they see is black tarp and barbed wire. And so the entire facility, they know they're on a death row unit. They know that they're surrounded by barbed wire. This is an incredibly punitive environment. In no way can this rehabilitate a child.
And I want to touch on something you said, right? Because some people sitting out there, you know, and even the folks that look like me, who this largely affects, right? They're going to say in their conservative nature, well, if they didn't do anything wrong, then they wouldn't be in this facility in the first place. They wouldn't have to go through this, right? And then they're going to say, well, if their parents had just done a better job, they wouldn't be in this facility in the first place. But there's some things that are just guaranteed in this country that's supposed to happen if you're looking at fair and equitable treatment. Not equal, fair and equitable treatment. If you're looking at fair and equitable treatment, you spoke of something that I want to pull out of that, which is their IEP. And these are already kids with trauma, some level of trouble in their life, multiple failed systems. It wasn't just the parent. When you get a kid that at this level that has IEPs, there's a few different things that happen there. I want you to break down, like, if a kid that kind of fits that trajectory is missing their IEP while they're going through a process that's supposed to be rehabilitating them, how bad is that for that kid?
I mean, a waterfall, I think, of effects. If you look at the data, many of the kids that are involved in OJJ and custody that have been adjudicated delinquent have accommodations, have diagnoses. And so there's a lot of things going on there. There's past trauma, there's learning disabilities. Often learning disabilities lead to school discipline, which leads to suspension and expulsion, school to prison pipeline. We're all very, familiar with that. So some of our kids do have IEPs and are not getting their accommodations. And in addition to the fact that their education is suffering greatly, they're being deprived of opportunities of getting their high set or getting, their certificates and things like that. It's also just incredibly mentally deflating. Like I said, they feel tossed out. They feel abandoned by society. And so what does that do to a person in these very formative years, in your adolescent years when your brain is at this rapid stage of development? What does that do to their psychological development to be deprived? And so schooling at Angola looks like sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day. That's what it looks like. We know of one teacher that might be on one block, one person who acts as a teacher, who can perhaps assist in some capacity, but there is no one guiding, providing instruction, and no one offering accommodation. So if someone has one-on-one on their accommodation, someone's supposed to be sitting with that kid, reading to them out loud, making sure they understand everything. And they're not getting that.
And that's what I wanted you to get into, because when a kid has an IEP, they have to learn in a very specific way. And if they're not learning in that way, they're not rehabilitating themselves.
No.
You're creating a situation where you're sending a kid back to a community that has already exposed him to trauma without the skills he need to even be on par with the rest of the students of his age. And there's going to be some idiot out there that says, well, that kid wasn't going to school anyway. You don't know where that kid was. And for the employees that work there, that consistently want to defend this because you want to defend the level of work that you're doing in these facilities, this ain't for you. Because guess what? We understand that you don't have enough resources to adequately do your job. So this is not about the employees. So stay out the comment section. This ain't about you at all. This is about the system that's failing both you and their child. Because they're placing them in a no-win situation. There's something else you said that I want to touch on that is really important, and it's the mass media hysteria around crime. It gets clicks when you talk about crime, right? So that means people are going to report it, and sometimes over-report it. Then you got these conservative blogs out here now that they're basically building a business by reporting bad things that happen in underserved communities, and some populations enjoy reading that, right? So it's creating this mass media hysteria around crime that we know historically has not worked out for people of color, people living in underserved communities, right? We look at the 94 crime bill, right? We can say that our current President Biden and Bernie Sanders got together and put this document together that oppressed a whole generation of black men. But if we said it just like that, the reality of it is that's not exactly the truth, right? at the time of the 94 crime bill, even though some of the elements of it are not reported factually, like some folks will tell you, well, the Congressional Black Caucus was in support of it, right? Some folks will tell you that the NAACP, the New Black Panther Party, and all these civil rights organizations were in support of the 94 crime bill. And that's just not correct. But who was in support of the 94 crime bill was largely African Americans in this country, because they were tired of the crime. They were tired of the gang violence. They were tired of losing their young women to the streets through crack addiction, right? Yeah. They were tired of losing their young men in the streets due to gang violence. They were tired of crime, so they essentially agreed to something at the time that would incarcerate a whole generation of black men. So every time we look at that 94 crime bill, we not only have Joe Biden to blame for that, we not only have Bernie Sanders to throw some blame on that for, we also have to look at the larger African-American populace, because they were largely asking for more criminal standards for criminal activity, not understanding that there would be far-reaching effects that would cost that man in 1994's great-grandchildren to be locked up one day, right? In this moment, what has feared me the most is that I've seen black people start to ask for the very same things that they asked for in 1994, not understanding the deep, dark history around those things. And if you give this country too much leverage to just do things to fix what is a mass hysteria around crime, and I get that people are getting shot and people are dying, and they're dying at the hands of folks that look like me, and the folks that are dying are folks that look like me. I get all that, but that's always been the case. You know, like, and I don't mean to make light of it. No, I know. But black people have always killed black people. White people have always killed white people. Asian people have always killed Asian people. It's crimes of proximity. That's what happens. It's not new to this time period. The only difference is now you turn on the TV every day and you see it. So it's causing this mass hysteria.
And social media has not helped. And
social media hasn't helped, right? And then in 2023, we have this strange association between race and class, right? Like, if you talk to a middle-class black person, it might sound like you're talking to a KKK member in 1967, right? It's this strange mix of race and class, and I know you can't say it, but I can. It's this strange mix of race and class that I think is detrimentally affecting our communities, because in 2023, you can have a black person living in 70817 that don't understand anything about 7805, but figure that they have the right to say something about it because they black. When realistically, generationally, they've been gone from those communities for a few different generations at this point, right? So they probably need to be quiet. And that creates a situation where the governor knew it was okay to put kids in Angola, because the people that it largely affected wanted them there, didn't care if they got there, right? Not everybody. I ain't talking to everybody. But when you looked at some of the things that were being said about children by folks that look like me, about little kids that look like them, it was disgusting and embarrassing at the same time that my people had fell that far. Because when we look at the aspect of keeping parents away from their children, that is something deeply rooted in this country and birthed in the inception of slavery. So to see us be okay with that, it makes me know that that slave, that little slave that's inside of some people that look like me, has been awakened in these last few years. And I know there's a lot of different reasons, right? Because Megan, just being honest, we hadn't won enough to get people to follow us, right? We try hard. We go to everybody to court, and they go, lady come up next to you, been trying and fighting these cases for years, but we haven't won enough. And people want to win, right? It's just what it is. But at the same time, we got to know that these notions aren't just the surface level things that we read in the headlines. We have to do the research on this. We have to dig deep, and we have to know it's not cool for children to be in 130-degree temps inside. Y'all would not last one day in your homes if the air went out.
I mean, just think about after hurricanes, when we all don't have power, and how hot our houses get, and how people flee as quickly as possible away from that heat if they are able. And we're willing to put, and that's the outside temperature. Now you're putting them inside a little heat box with no ventilation, no nothing, and just sitting there. And they're supposed to sleep like that. Can you sleep at 140 degrees? So now they're sleep deprived. They're exhausted. When we go to visit them, they can barely hold their heads up because they're so tired from the heat and the lack of sleep and all of that. So to go and sit in a room with these kids and to hear what they have experienced, you will, I will never be the same. But this is supposed to be the land of the free, and we're going to put kids in conditions that we don't put prisoners of war in. I mean, this is literally our children. And so I can't speak to what it feels like to live in a community where my neighbors are being shot, because that has not been my reality. And so I realize how privileged I am to come from the space that I come. So I would never judge anyone for feeling the way that they feel about how they should handle what they deem as crime. But I do ask that people look to the source of the hysteria, look at what all of this is rooted in and who is benefiting from this. Because at the end of the day, the people benefiting from kids being in Angola is not the community. So, Angola was a slave plantation. It's the heart of it. Even before the crime bill, there's the war on drugs. There's obviously, Jim Crow, there's slavery. It's all rooted in the same narrative, all of it. It all goes back to the same narrative. And if we are so eager to put kids in cages for 15 hours a day, sometimes days at a time, 24 hours a day, days at a time, and we have been doing that in this country for centuries, and it has not changed.
Hasn't worked.
Anything. Can we try something else? I mean, this is not working. So if it's not working now, it's not going to work 5 years from now or 10 years from now. 1 in 3 black men in this country will go to jail in their lifetime. What? What in America? There has got to be a better way. And I do want to say that, I want the listeners to know that we have filed a preliminary injunction asking for this to be addressed, because we're not going to sit here and let kids be in 140-degree temperatures and do nothing about it. So there is a hearing in August 15th, that will address the conditions that these kids are under. And we hope, in that time we get more information and we're able to get them out.
So, Ms. Nancy, it's Attorney Nancy Rosenblum. You've been doing this work and working cases like this for a number of years. Tell us, what brings you down here to look at this Angola case? Why is this case so important?
So many reasons. Well, local folks brought us in. They asked for our expertise and our experience nationally, bringing cases about not only the conditions in prisons and jails, but how to work with the systems to get folks out, to shrink these systems as much as possible, to address the inhumane conditions that people have suffered when they are incarcerated in, immigration detention, local jails, and prison systems.
So these kids living in 130-degree heat, when you hear that, it ties your heart up, right? But I gotta imagine that there's some legal stuff that this state is probably getting trapped into by allowing these kids to stay in extreme heat. What are some of those things?
Yeah, very basically, the United States Constitution requires the humane treatment of people when they're incarcerated. And for children, there's an even higher standard. Children, the United States Supreme Court for many years has recognized that children are different. And we've seen in past decades the elimination of the death penalty for people who committed crimes while they were juveniles, the elimination of life without parole. Kids are different. And so it's the Constitution, it's the 8th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, guarantee those rights. There are also other laws. The reason we're in federal court is it's the federal Constitution and the federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Rehabilitation Act, which address those children who have mental health or learning disabilities or other kinds of disabilities who have a right to services and fair treatment.
So Louisiana is in federal court once again because of prison conditions, and this time for children. How much money is this costing the state?
One of the things that the families raised, the families of these kids, and that we lawyers have helped them voice, was that these resources are going to the wrong place, right? This is a system, OJJ, that has been broken. It's extra sad because Louisiana was one of the first states to take on juvenile justice reform. There's something called the Missouri model, which has the best practices of shrinking the system, building community-based alternative programs, keeping a minimal number of kids in any kind of secure confinement, and providing a service-rich environment. This has been proven over and over to reduce criminal activity by kids. That's where the money needs to go. There is so much waste here. When we went into the court back in August and September to try and stop this from happening after Governor Edwards announced it, we warned that money should not be spent on painting up the bars in Angola, which is what they've done. Is basically that's the physical changes. They've painted the bars on those death row cells, on hiring new staff, on all the things that OJJ promised they would do. Money shouldn't be spent on that. And in fact, a public records request by the Friends and Family of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, FLIC, they got back a couple of documents. And one of the documents shows, it's a little hard to interpret, but it shows that at least $3.5 million has been allocated so far in the last fiscal year toward this facility that is currently housing 15 children. But over time, they've now acknowledged they've had 70 to 80 kids there. So that's a whole lot of money. And that is money that could be used for far better purposes.
So literally, Louisiana is not only making a social commitment to stupidity, they're making a financial commitment to stupidity.
Those are your tax dollars at work. I mean, this is Governor Edwards came up with this plan, has stuck to it religiously, and that is what's happening. That's where that money is going. The state has chosen to hire private outside counsel instead of having their own lawyers, the Attorney General's office, defend this case. Mm-hmm. You're right, that costs money. Going to court is part of a strategy, right? Getting public information out there like we're doing now is part of the strategy. There's legislative advocacy going on. It's a big strategy. Nobody ever solves a problem by litigating their way out of it. But a federal court order in a class action directing the state not to use a facility, that's pretty powerful. So we're there to do that piece of it. You know, I'm not an expert on Louisiana politics. I know some of the history, but I'm not from here. I'll admit that. And, you know, I'm here to help with that piece of it. So what does the lawsuit ask for? I mean, we're the lawyers. It's the children who are suing. Children we've talked to, and on behalf of any child who's been at that facility or who is at risk of going there. So that's about 300 kids who are currently in secure custody with OJJ. That's OJJ determines the level. So any of them could go there. So the lawsuit asked for the facility not to be opened. Now that it's open, the current motion, emergency motion that we filed for an injunction, asks that children be transferred out of there immediately and that no other children be placed there. Also, the bigger lawsuit asks for no children in the juvenile delinquency system ever to be placed anywhere on the grounds of an adult prison facility.
It's just not a good idea. And we, on this side of things, we talked about this. Like, we knew there would be issues. We knew there would be problems because it wasn't designed for that. So we knew that there would just be some things that came up that, honestly, it ain't right for adults to go through some of these things, right? I sat in court last time, pretty much every day. just listening to the trial. And it was a very strange trial, right? Because it was the first time I had seen lawyers on our side of things win, but not really win. The judge was like, hey, y'all are right about everything. I just don't know what else to do. And I respected the judge so much after that for that response, because it was an honest response, right? It was, hey, we know this is bad, but I really don't know what else to do. I would respect this system if they just said that.
You know, there has been a little bit of a narrative of we don't know what else to do, but that narrative is built by the adults running the system as these are bad kids. These are the worst of the worst, bad kids. That's not what's going on. This is not a failure of the children. This is a failure of adults. They have a system. They were on the road to making a less punitive, truly rehabilitative system that would keep kids in for a minimum of time, return them to their communities with supports and services. That's what we need. It's not difficult. Everybody knows it. Louisiana changed course, and the current administration has been stuck with what they came in and saw. This is not the correct response. Those $3.5 million plus could have been spent maybe hiring staff, maybe providing more services at the other facilities, maybe making kids and staff safer in those facilities.
Yeah, and just politically, when you look at this, I think we're going to be looking at Angola and studying it for years, right? Especially when we talk about Southern politics, because this is basically a Democratic administration tearing down the work that another Democratic administration put in place, which is unheard of, right? You never really see that. Even the Democrats that went to the White House on the 94 crime bill still didn't tear down the 94 crime bill. They might have done some things, but you will not find one quote from President Obama saying we're going to tear down the 94 crime bill, because it was party politics, right? But when you look at just everything that has happened with this particular situation, it's been as different as anything you've ever seen.
Eugene, it's so different and shocking that the federal government, folks at the Department of Justice, reached out to Louisiana early on and said, don't do this. There's an office called the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention.
The Department of Justice.
It's part of DOJ, but this is the kids' part, right?
Department of Justice.
And the person running that division comes from our side, comes from advocacy. She reached out with her folks and said, let us work with you. Foundations have worked out and have come in and said, let us give you money, Louisiana, to help you create a better system, build a better system.
So
No, thank you, was the response.
So people that usually put kids like this in jail call Louisiana.
It's
and
different side of DOJ.
I get it, but on the surface level, some folks that are usually attached, right? Usually attached to folks that put kids like this in jail, decided to call Louisiana and say, hey, this ain't a good idea.
Well, and here's why. Louisiana is the
Make
first.
that up.
You don't want to be the first in this category, the first to put kids in the delinquency system in an adult prison. Is the first and only state to have ever done that in modern history.
So, attorney, like what you're telling me is, and this is sad, right? It's so sad, it's comical that other states reached out and said, you guys are setting the horrible precedents. And it wasn't enough to slow us up.
There is nothing normal about this. It's an unusual situation, and it's a shocking situation. Not that we don't go help bring cases in other places where it's the usual situation, but this is extra.